Between November 8th and 10th, 1979, 12 men were eliminated across the remote hollows of Pike County, Kentucky, in what would become known as the Harlow purge. All adults, all connected to a single moonshine operation run by the McCoy family. The method was surgical: rifle shots from distance, ambushes on dark mountain roads, accidents that weren't accidents. The perpetrators weren't rival gangs or federal agents. They were 4 members of the Harlow family, a father and his 3 sons, moving through the mountains like ghosts, methodically erasing everyone who knew their secret. The FBI would later call it one of the most calculated eliminations in Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't territory, wasn't a drug war, wasn't even revenge for violence. It was a recipe, a moonshine recipe that had been in the Harlow family for 63 years, stolen by men they'd once called neighbors. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Pike County, Kentucky, wasn't much more than scattered settlements across 788 square miles of unforgiving Cumberland mountain terrain in the fall of 1979. Population 81,000, spread across hollows so deep and narrow that radio signals couldn't penetrate, where ridgelines rose like ancient walls and valleys stayed dark even at midday. The nearest real town, Pikeville, sat at the county's heart. But most folks in the outer hollows had never been farther than the county line. November in the mountains meant temperatures dropping to 28 degrees at night, rising to maybe 45 by afternoon, if you were lucky. The air smelled like wood smoke from coal stoves, damp limestone from the caves that honeycombed the mountains, and that particular sharp scent of approaching winter that people who live in Appalachia learn to recognize in their bones. Mornings brought fog so thick you couldn't see 50 feet ahead on Route 23. The sound of the place was wind, moving through bare hickory branches, distant chainsaws, biting into oak and pine, and every so often the rumble of a pickup truck grinding up some impossible grade in low gear, transmission screaming. But 1979 was a catastrophic year in eastern Kentucky coal country. The industry that had sustained these mountains for nearly a century was dying in a way that felt like betrayal. Mechanization had eliminated 40,000 jobs since 1950. What took 20 men to do in 1940 now took 2 men and a machine. Companies were pulling out, leaving behind abandoned mines with entrances sealed in concrete and families with no way to make a living. In Pike County, unemployment hit 38% that fall. For men who'd grown up believing that hard work underground guaranteed survival, watching the economy collapse felt like everything they'd been promised was a lie. The coal seams were still there, still full of carbon that could burn, but the companies had decided human labor cost too much. Disability checks and food stamps couldn't feed a family of 6. The government cheese they handed out at the community center once a month wasn't enough. Pride prevented most mountain people from asking for more help, even if it existed. In places like Pike County, moonshine wasn't just a business or a quaint tradition from folk songs. It was the shadow economy. The difference between keeping your lights on and sitting in the dark. Federal taxes on legal liquor made it too expensive for mountain people who were barely scraping by. So they made their own, following recipes passed down through generations, using skills their great-grandfathers had brought from Scotland and Ireland 2 centuries before when they first settled these hollows. The law said it was illegal. The mountains said it was survival. And in 1979, with no other jobs available and families going hungry, moonshining was how you kept your children fed. The terrain made enforcement nearly impossible. Pike County had 788 square miles of the most rugged landscape in Kentucky. Hollows branched off hollows. Dirt roads turned to mud tracks that only locals knew, and the dense forest canopy hid everything from aerial surveillance. The state police barracks sat 60 miles away in Pikeville, and they had maybe 15 officers to cover the entire county. Response time to the outer settlements could be 2 hours if the roads were passable, longer if it rained. The sheriff's department was understaffed and underfunded. Federal agents appeared occasionally, busted a still or two for the newspapers, then disappeared back to Lexington or Louisville. In this vacuum where law couldn't or wouldn't reach, the mountains developed their own codes. You settled your own disputes because nobody else would. You protected your own family because the sheriff was 60 miles away. You didn't involve outsiders in mountain business because outsiders didn't understand the rules that had kept these communities functioning for 200 years. Honor mattered more than law because law had never protected people like the Harlows or the McCoys. If someone stole from you, you handled it yourself. If someone disrespected your family, you made them answer for it. The code wasn't written down anywhere, wasn't taught in schools, but everyone who grew up in these hollows understood it completely. You could trust your neighbors because reputation was everything in a place where everyone knew everyone else's family going back 5 generations. But if someone violated that trust, if they stole what was yours or disrespected what you held sacred, the code demanded a response, not because you were violent by nature, but because allowing disrespect meant you were weak, and weakness in these mountains could get you killed or run off your land. Moonshining itself followed strict codes. You didn't sell to kids. You didn't cut your product with methanol or other poisons that could blind or kill people. You took pride in your craft, in making the cleanest, smoothest whiskey possible. The best shiners were respected in the community, known for their quality, for recipes that had been perfected over decades. A good moonshiner could make 100 gallons a week in a single still, sell it for $15 a gallon, and clear $600 after expenses. That was more than 3 months' wages from the mines when the mines were still hiring. But it required equipment, copper stills that cost thousands to build, and knowledge that took years to acquire. Most importantly, it required a recipe that people wanted to buy, something distinctive enough that customers sought it out specifically, that distributors would pay premium prices for because they knew they could sell every drop. Raymond Harlow was 57 years old that November, though he looked closer to 70. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, but decades spent hunched in coal seams, barely 4 feet high, had left him stooped forward. His spine curved in a way that caused constant pain. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen with arthritis that flared every time the temperature dropped, fingers stained permanently black from coal dust that no amount of scrubbing could remove. A thick scar ran from his left ear down to his collarbone, pink and puckered. A souvenir from a roof collapse in 1964 that killed 4 men standing right beside him. A support beam had caught him across the throat, nearly decapitated him. and only the quick work of a medic who happened to be 200 feet away in the tunnel saved his life. He walked with a pronounced limp, his right leg shorter than his left by half an inch, where the bones had been crushed and never quite healed straight. When the weather turned cold, that limp became so severe his youngest son had to help him up the porch steps of the house his grandfather had built in 1923. Every morning, Raymond woke at 5 o'clock in darkness that felt like being back underground. He'd make coffee in a percolator so old the bottom was worn thin, the aluminum showing through the enamel coating. The coffee he made was strong enough to strip paint, thick and black and bitter. The kind of coffee that coal miners drank to stay awake during double shifts. He'd sit at the kitchen table smoking hand-rolled cigarettes while he read one chapter from his grandfather's journal, the leather-bound book Ezra Harlow had started writing in 1916 when he first developed the recipe. Raymond didn't talk much in those early hours, just sat, smoked, drank coffee, and thought about the day ahead. By 5:30, he'd be out the door, checking the still hidden 3 miles back in Raccoon Hollow, following trails only he and his sons knew, paths that didn't appear on any map because they'd been worn into the mountain over 60 years of careful feet, avoiding the same rocks and roots. He'd married Clara Jean Hendricks in 1950, right after he came home from Korea, with nightmares and that scar. The war had taught him things about violence he'd never wanted to know, about how easy it was to kill a man from distance, how the body fell when the bullet hit center mass, how long it took for the light to leave someone's eyes. They'd had 3 boys. Thomas was 32 now, back from Vietnam, with his own nightmares, his own knowledge of killing that he'd brought home like a disease. Jesse was 29, quieter than his older brother, but just as capable when circumstances demanded it. Michael was 24, the youngest, still trying to figure out who he was beyond being Raymond Harlow's son. Clara was 55, her hands as work-worn as Raymond's, her face still beautiful despite everything the mountains had demanded from her. What Raymond valued most wasn't money, though God knew they needed it with 6 adults to feed and no legitimate income. He'd never had much money anyway, had grown up during the Depression when nobody had anything. What he valued was legacy. The idea that his life had meant something beyond just surviving. That he could pass something of value to his children in a world that seemed determined to take everything from men like him. Thomas Raymond Harlow was 32 that November, the eldest son bearing his father's name as his middle name like a burden and a blessing. He stood 6 feet tall, lean and ropey, with muscle that came from years of physical labor rather than gym time. His most distinctive feature was his eyes, pale blue, like ice on a mountain stream. The kind of eyes that looked through you rather than at you. Those eyes had seen things in Vietnam that had changed him permanently. He'd served 2 tours as a sniper with the 25th Infantry Division, 1967 to 1969, accumulating 43 confirmed kills that the Army knew about, and probably twice that many they didn't. He'd come home in 1970 with a Bronze Star, nightmares that woke his wife screaming, and knowledge of killing that transferred perfectly from jungle warfare to mountain hunting. He was married to a woman named Jennifer, had 2 daughters aged 8 and 6, worked occasionally as a hunting guide for tourists who wanted to bag deer or elk in the Cumberland Mountains, and drank too much when the memories got particularly bad. David Eugene Harlow was 29, the middle son born between two wars and shaped by the absence of both. Where Thomas was the weapon, David was the mechanic, the one who understood how things worked and how to make them stop working. He stood 5 feet 11 inches tall, built solid with a barrel chest and arms thick from years of turning wrenches. He worked at a garage in Pikeville, could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone, could take apart a carburetor blindfolded, and put it back together in minutes. He'd tried to enlist in 1968 when Thomas was in Vietnam, but the Army rejected him for a heart murmur they detected during the physical. The rejection had humiliated him, made him feel like less than his older brother, who'd gone to war and come back decorated. He'd married young, divorced at 25 when his wife left for Ohio with a coal company manager, and now lived alone in a trailer near the family homestead. He was quiet, methodical, the kind of man who thought 3 steps ahead, who planned everything carefully before acting. Michael James Harlow was 24, the youngest, still figuring out where he fit in a family of men who'd all found their purposes in violence or survival. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, the biggest of the brothers, with broad shoulders and hands even larger than his father's. His size came from his mother's side, from Clara's father, who'd been a logger and could carry a 100-pound chainsaw up a mountain without breathing hard. Michael had graduated high school in 1973, tried community college for a semester, dropped out when the money ran out, and now worked occasional construction jobs when they were available. He'd never been to war, had missed Vietnam by 2 years, and been grateful for it, even though that gratitude made him feel guilty when he saw what it had done to Thomas. He was dating a girl named Rebecca from Virgie, had vague plans about maybe getting married, maybe moving somewhere else, anywhere that wasn't Pike County and moonshine and economic collapse. But family loyalty ran deeper than dreams of escape. Their mother, Clara Jean Harlow, was 55 that November, a thin woman whose face had been worn smooth by worry, like a river stone polished by decades of current. She'd been beautiful once. Her wedding photos showed a girl with dark hair and bright eyes, full of hope for the future. 3 decades of mountain life had ground that hope into resignation. She'd buried 2 of her own brothers in mining accidents, 1958 and 1962, had watched the town she grew up in slowly die as the coal companies pulled out, and now lived with the knowledge that her husband and sons were one informant away from federal prison. She didn't involve herself in the moonshine business directly, didn't ask questions about where Raymond went before dawn or what her sons did on nights when they came home smelling like wood smoke and corn mash. She kept house, grew vegetables in the garden Ezra had planted in 1925, canned food for winter, attended church on Sundays, and prayed that the law would never come knocking. The 4 Harlow men weren't particularly close in the day-to-day sense that some families were. They didn't sit around reminiscing about childhood or talk about feelings or share their deepest fears, but they understood each other completely. They communicated in shorthand, in glances and nods, in codes that outsiders couldn't decipher. Thomas brought military training, the ability to plan operations, to think strategically about sightlines and timing and coordinated movement. David brought technical knowledge, understanding of vehicles and tools, the ability to make accidents look convincing, Michael brought youth and strength, the physical capability to do what age had stolen from Raymond. And Raymond brought something none of his sons had, the absolute certainty that what they were protecting mattered more than their own lives, more than law, more than anything except family itself. Together, they formed a unit that would prove more dangerous than any of them could have predicted. Raymond's great-grandfather, Ezra Thompson Harlow, had developed their moonshine recipe during Prohibition, back when making liquor was both an act of rebellion and an act of survival. But Ezra had actually started experimenting in 1916, 5 years before Prohibition even began, when he was just 23 years old and newly married, trying to find a way to make money from the rocky hillside farm his father had left him. The secret wasn't just in the corn, though Ezra had perfected the ratio of 60% yellow corn to 40% white corn after years of experimentation, planting different varieties, testing which combinations produced the smoothest flavor. It wasn't just the fermentation time, though that mattered too. Exactly 11 days at temperatures between 68 and 72 degrees. No warmer or cooler, or the flavor turned harsh. The real secret, the thing that made Harlow moonshine impossible to replicate without knowing the exact method, was the addition of wild ginseng root during the distilling process. Ezra had discovered it by accident in 1918. He'd been experimenting with different additives, trying to create something distinctive, something that would make his products stand out in a market flooded with corn whiskey that all tasted basically the same. He tried hickory bark, sassafras, wild honey, even tobacco leaves. Nothing worked quite right until one autumn day when he'd been digging ginseng in the woods, the valuable root that grew wild in these mountains and sold for good money to Chinese buyers in Pikeville. He'd come back to check his still with ginseng dirt still on his hands, had inadvertently dropped a small piece of root into the mash and forgotten about it. 3 days later, when he ran that batch through the copper coils, he tasted something different, a subtle earthiness beneath the corn sweetness, a clean finish that didn't burn the throat, a flavor profile he'd never achieved before. It took him 2 more years to perfect the exact method. The ginseng had to be wild, not cultivated, because wild root had compounds that domestic crops lacked. It had to be added during distillation, not fermentation at precisely 173 degrees Fahrenheit, no hotter or cooler. The temperature mattered because too hot and the ginseng compounds broke down, too cool and they didn't release. The duration mattered too, exactly 18 minutes at that temperature, timed with a pocket watch Ezra had bought specifically for the purpose. The amount mattered. 3 ounces of dried root per 10 gallons of mash, measured on a scale accurate to the 1/4 ounce. Get any of these variables wrong, and the flavor disappeared, or worse, turned bitter and undrinkable. But get them exactly right, and you produced moonshine that tasted like nothing else available in eastern Kentucky, smooth and complex with that subtle ginseng note that made people remember it, that made them seek it out specifically, that made distributors willing to pay $15 a gallon when everyone else was getting 10. That recipe had kept the Harlow family afloat through the Depression when half the county was starving. It had sustained them through World War II when sugar rationing made moonshining nearly impossible. but the Harlows adapted by reducing batch sizes and charging more. It had survived the coal boom years of the 50s when legitimate work was available, but Raymond kept the still running anyway because he understood boom times didn't last. It had endured through Raymond's time, passed from Ezra to Raymond's grandfather William in 1938, from William to Raymond's father, Charles, in 1952, from Charles to Raymond in 1968, when his father died of black lung at 59. And someday, Raymond intended to pass it to Thomas, to give his eldest son the same inheritance he'd received, the same knowledge that connected them to Ezra and all the years in between. It wasn't just whiskey to Raymond, it was identity. Proof that the Harlow family had created something of value in a world that told men like them they were worthless. It was connection to ancestors who'd walked these same mountains a century before, who'd survived against impossible odds, who'd built something from nothing. It was the only inheritance Raymond could leave his children in a world where men like him had nothing else. No money in the bank, no property worth anything, no stocks or bonds or college funds, just knowledge. A recipe written in his grandfather's handwriting in a leather journal that smelled like tobacco, and old paper, measurements and temperatures and timing that represented 63 years of survival. In August 1979, that inheritance was stolen. The McCoy family lived 6 miles southeast of the Harlow homestead, near the old Majestic mining camp that had been abandoned since the company pulled out in 1976. Dalton Eugene McCoy was 43 years old that fall, shorter than Raymond at 5 feet 9 inches, but built solid with a barrel chest and arms thick from years of manual labor. His beard had gone mostly gray, though his hair still held some of its original brown. He had a loud, friendly voice, the kind of man who could tell stories that kept a room laughing, who remembered everyone's name and asked about their families. He'd worked in the mines for 21 years, from 1956 until the Majestic operation shut down. And like everyone else in Pike County, he'd found himself unemployed at 41 with no prospects and a family to feed. Dalton had a wife named Sarah, 40 years old, who worked part-time at the elementary school in Virgie, making barely enough to cover groceries. They had 4 children. The oldest son, James, was 25, married with a baby on the way, working occasional construction jobs that paid under the table. Daughter, Rebecca, was 22, smart enough for college but no money to send her, working as a waitress at a diner in Pikeville and dreaming of escape. Son Daniel was 19, the one who needed surgery for a herniated disc in his spine, the medical bills they couldn't pay even with Sarah's insurance from the school. The youngest, Matthew, was 16, still in high school, playing basketball and trying not to think about what happened after graduation when there were no jobs and no future. Sarah had gone to school with Clara Harlow, not friends exactly, but they knew each other, attended the same Baptist church for years, their families crossing paths at community events and funerals. Dalton's moonshine operation wasn't as established as the Harlows. He'd only started in 1977, 2 years earlier, after the mine closed and the disability check he got for his ruined knees wasn't enough to live on. His brothers helped him, Vernon and Carl, along with several cousins and nephews, about 12 men total, who worked the still and handled distribution. They weren't criminals by nature, weren't violent men or career lawbreakers. They were just fathers and brothers trying to survive in an economy that had abandoned them. following the same path their grandfathers had walked during the Depression, making illegal whiskey because it was the only option left. Dalton's product was decent, sold for $10 a gallon to distributors in Pikeville and Hazard, brought in enough money to keep the lights on and food on the table, but it wasn't special. People bought it because it was available and cheap, not because they sought it out specifically. The McCoy still sat in a hollow off Coon Creek, 3 miles back in the woods, accessible only by an overgrown logging road that most people didn't know existed. They ran smaller batches than the Harlows, maybe 50 gallons a week, sold mostly to local buyers rather than the wider distribution network Raymond had built over decades. Vernon McCoy, 40 years old, handled most of the selling, driving to Pikeville twice a week with mason jars packed in wooden crates, meeting buyers at predetermined locations, bringing back cash that got divided among the 12 men who worked the operation. Carl McCoy, 38, the youngest of the three brothers, managed the actual production, watching temperatures, testing the mash, running the distillation process. The cousins and nephews provided muscle, hauled supplies, chopped wood for the fire that heated the still, kept watch for revenuers who occasionally ventured this far into the mountains. These weren't bad men. They attended church on Sundays when they weren't too tired or too hungover. They helped neighbors with roof repairs and car trouble. They volunteered at the fire department and coached Little League. Vernon's wife taught Sunday school. Carl's daughter sang in the church choir. They were embedded in the community the same way the Harlows were, known and generally respected despite everyone knowing what they did for money. The law against moonshining was federal, imposed by people in Washington who'd never spent a winter in Appalachia wondering how to feed 6 kids when there were no jobs. Local law enforcement mostly looked the other way as long as you weren't too obvious, weren't selling to minors, weren't causing trouble. Sheriff Dennis Porter had grown up in Pike County, understood the economics, knew that if he arrested every moonshiner in the county, he'd empty out half the hollows. So an informal arrangement existed. You kept it quiet. He pretended not to know. Everyone survived. Halloween night, 1979, fell on a Wednesday. The temperature dropped to 32 degrees after sunset, cold enough that frost formed on windshields and turned the unpaved roads slick. Raymond Harlow and his family attended a funeral in Pikeville for Clara's sister Margaret, who died of cancer at 53 after fighting it for 2 years. The service was at 6 o'clock in the evening at the First Baptist Church on Main Street. Raymond, Clara, and their 3 sons all attended, dressed in the same dark suits they wore to every funeral, standing in a pew singing hymns while Margaret's casket sat at the front, covered in white lilies. The funeral ran long. The preacher gave a 40-minute sermon about resurrection and eternal life. People lined up to view the body, to offer condolences to Margaret's husband and children. By the time the Harlows got back to their truck in the church parking lot, it was nearly 9 o'clock. They drove home through darkness so complete it felt solid, the truck's headlights barely cutting through fog that had settled into the hollows. Raymond dropped Clara at the house. She was exhausted from grief and needed to lie down. Then he and his sons should have checked the still like they did every night. But Thomas's wife had called. One of his daughters had a fever and was asking for him. So Thomas took Raymond's truck and drove home. David's back was bothering him. The cold made his muscles seize up. So Raymond told him to stay home and rest. Michael had plans to see his girlfriend Rebecca, had promised to take her to a movie in Pikeville. So for the first time in months, maybe years, the still in Raccoon Hollow sat unwatched overnight. Just one night, one deviation from routine. But that was all it took. Whoever broke in knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't take equipment. The copper coils and condensers were still there, untouched. They didn't take the finished product. The mason jars of moonshine Raymond had ready for delivery sat exactly where he'd left them. They didn't vandalize anything or try to destroy the operation. What disappeared was specific and devastating. Raymond's grandfather's journal, the leather-bound book Ezra had started in 1916, containing the complete recipe with precise measurements, temperatures, timing, and the secret about the ginseng root that made Harlow moonshine irreplaceable. The journal had been kept in a waterproof metal box, military surplus from Korea, buried 18 inches underground beneath the still, in a location marked by 3 specific rocks arranged in a triangle. Only someone who knew exactly where to look, who'd been told or shown the hiding spot, could have found it. Raymond discovered the theft November 1st at dawn. He woke at 5 o'clock like always, made his coffee, smoked his cigarette, and headed out to check the still, while the sky was still dark and fog hung in the trees like cotton. Temperature had dropped to 28 degrees overnight. Everything was covered in frost that crunched under his boots. He followed the trail he'd walked 10,000 times, 3 miles through woods where he knew every tree and rock, where he could navigate blindfolded. He reached the still site at 5:45, checked the temperature of the mash, tested a sample. Everything looked normal. Then he walked to the 3 rocks, knelt down, started to brush away leaves and dirt, to check on the journal like he did every few days, make sure the waterproof seal was holding, that moisture hadn't gotten in. His hands hit empty dirt. He dug deeper, thinking maybe he'd miscounted the depth. Maybe 18 inches had settled to 16. Nothing. He dug wider, thinking maybe he'd misjudged the exact spot between the 3 rocks. Still nothing. The cold spreading through his chest had nothing to do with temperature. His hands were shaking as he dug through frozen earth, tearing at it with his fingers until they bled, knowing already what he'd find, but unable to stop searching. The box was gone. 63 years of family legacy, stolen. The only copy of Ezra's journal, with all the measurements and methods, written in fading ink on pages that smelled like tobacco and time. Raymond knelt there in the dirt as the sun came up, hands bleeding, and felt something break inside him that would never heal. Raymond didn't tell anyone immediately. He went home that morning, washed the blood off his hands, told Clara the still was fine, everything was normal. He spent 3 days trying to convince himself there was an explanation that didn't involve theft. Maybe he'd moved the box and forgotten, though he knew that was impossible. Maybe one of his sons had taken it for safekeeping, though when he asked them carefully, indirectly, they all said no. Maybe the box had somehow sunk deeper into the ground, though 18 inches through clay and rock didn't just disappear. By November 4th, a Sunday, he couldn't avoid the truth anymore. Someone had stolen the journal. Someone who knew where it was hidden, who understood what it meant, who wanted the recipe badly enough to take it. Word traveled through Pike County like water running downhill, following the path of least resistance through family connections and business relationships and the informal networks that connected everyone in these mountains. On November 4th, Raymond heard from Tommy Mitchell, a distributor in Pikeville, who bought Harlow moonshine by the case and resold it to buyers in Lexington and Charleston. Tommy pulled Raymond aside after church, said he needed to talk privately, led him out to the parking lot where they could speak without being overheard. Tommy said he'd tried some McCoy product the day before, bought a jar from a buyer who usually carried Harlow shine but said the McCoys had something new. Tommy said it tasted different than McCoy's usual product, better, smoother, and there was something in the finish he couldn't quite identify, but that reminded him strongly of Harlow moonshine. Raymond felt his stomach drop, but kept his face neutral. Asked Tommy if he still had the jar. Tommy said no, he'd finished it, but he could get more if Raymond wanted. Raymond said yes, bring me a jar tomorrow, and spent the rest of Sunday trying to breathe normally, trying not to let Clara see the rage building inside him like pressure in a sealed container. Monday morning, November 5th, Tommy showed up at the Harlow property at 7 o'clock with a mason jar, wrapped in newspaper. Raymond took it to the kitchen table, unscrewed the lid, smelled it first. The scent was familiar, too familiar. Corn and sweetness, and underneath it something earthy that shouldn't be there unless you knew the secret. He poured a small amount into a glass, held it up to the light. The clarity was perfect. No cloudiness, professionally made. Then he tasted it. The ginseng note was unmistakable, subtle but present. That distinctive earthiness that Ezra had discovered in 1918, that had been the Harlow signature for 63 years. Raymond sat at that table for 20 minutes, holding the glass, tasting it again and again to be sure. But he'd been drinking this recipe since he was 16 years old, had helped his father make it 1,000 times, knew every note and nuance, like he knew his own reflection. This was Harlow moonshine, or close enough that the difference didn't matter. Someone had the journal, had followed Ezra's instructions, had replicated the one thing that made the Harlow family special. Thomas, David, and Michael came into the kitchen, saw their father's face, understood without being told that something catastrophic had happened. Clara stood in the doorway, watching her husband's expression transform into something she'd never seen before. Not in 30 years of marriage, not even when he came home from Korea with nightmares. This was colder than rage, more dangerous than anger. A calculation happening behind his eyes that terrified her. Raymond set down the glass, looked at his sons, and said 5 words that would condemn 12 men to death and destroy 2 families completely. They took the only thing we had that was ours. He didn't raise his voice, didn't curse or threaten, just stated it as fact. Thomas understood first, his military training recognizing the tone commanders used when issuing orders that couldn't be questioned. David and Michael looked at each other, then at their father, and nodded. Clara turned away, couldn't watch, went to the bedroom, and closed the door because she knew what was coming and couldn't stop it. Raymond tried the civilized approach first. He wasn't a man who rushed into violence despite what Korea had taught him. Despite the coal mine accidents he'd survived, that had shown him how quickly life could end. He believed in codes, in giving men a chance to explain themselves, in allowing for the possibility of misunderstanding, even when his gut told him there was no misunderstanding possible. On November 5th, Monday afternoon, he drove his truck to the McCoy property, 6 miles of winding mountain roads that gave him time to rehearse what he'd say, how he'd approach this without immediate accusations. He found Dalton McCoy on the front porch of his house, a small clapboard structure that looked exactly like 100 other houses scattered through Pike County. Nothing special, nothing that suggested wealth or ambition beyond simple survival. Dalton was drinking coffee, seemed surprised to see Raymond, but not alarmed, offered him a cup, which Raymond declined. Raymond stood at the bottom of the porch steps, didn't want to go inside where the conversation might be witnessed by Dalton's wife or children, needed this to be between men who understood mountain codes. He asked directly, no preamble, no social niceties that would blur the question. "Did you take my grandfather's journal from the still site in Raccoon Hollow?" Dalton's face changed. Not quite guilt, but something close. A flicker of recognition before he controlled his expression. He denied it, said he didn't know what Raymond was talking about, said the McCoys had their own recipe they'd been improving through experimentation. But his eyes wouldn't meet Raymond's, kept sliding away to look at the trees or the ground or anything except the man standing in front of him asking questions he couldn't answer honestly. Raymond tried again, explained what the journal meant, not just the recipe, but the history, 63 years of Harlow family legacy, the only inheritance he had to pass to his sons. He said if there'd been a misunderstanding, if someone had borrowed it thinking they'd return it, now was the time to make it right. No consequences, no hard feelings, just give it back and they'd forget this conversation ever happened. Dalton maintained his denial, said he was sorry Raymond had lost something valuable, suggested maybe it had been federal agents. Maybe revenuers had found the still and taken evidence. The lie was transparent, insultingly obvious, and Raymond felt the restraint he'd been maintaining start to crack. He left without another word, drove home in silence, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. November 6th, Tuesday. Raymond tried again. This time he brought Thomas as witness, wanted someone else to hear Dalton's responses, to confirm he wasn't imagining the evasion and dishonesty. They arrived at 9 o'clock in the morning, found Dalton and his brother Vernon working on a truck in the driveway, greasy and defensive. Vernon was more aggressive than Dalton, told Raymond they were tired of accusations, said he had no proof of anything, that maybe the Harlows just couldn't handle competition. "Can't prove nothing," Vernon said, wiping his hands on a rag that left streaks of oil on his jeans. "Recipe ain't copyrighted. Anybody can make moonshine taste however they want." Thomas stepped forward, his military bearing making him seem taller than his 6 feet, and Vernon backed up slightly, recognizing something dangerous in the way Thomas moved. Raymond tried one more time. November 7th, Wednesday. He went to Sheriff Dennis Porter's office in Pikeville, explained the situation as clearly as he could, without explicitly admitting to federal crimes. He said a family heirloom had been stolen, a journal with sentimental value, and he had strong reason to believe the McCoy family had taken it. Sheriff Porter, 62 years old and tired after 30 years of trying to enforce law in mountains where law barely existed, listened politely and explained there was nothing he could do. "Ain't no law against making moonshine taste better, Raymond," the sheriff said, not unkindly. Can't prove theft without evidence, can't search their property without a warrant, and no judge is going to issue a warrant over a missing journal when we all know what's really in it. The system offered no protection, no recourse, no justice. The code was clear now. You settled your own debts because nobody else would. Nobody else could. That night, November 7th, 1979, Raymond sat at the kitchen table with his sons after Clara had gone to bed. She knew what they were discussing, could hear the low voices through the bedroom door, but she couldn't bear to witness it, couldn't watch her husband and sons plan something that would destroy them all, regardless of the outcome. Raymond spread topographic maps of Pike County across the table, maps he'd been using for 30 years to navigate the mountains, to find the best still sites, to avoid roads where law enforcement might travel. Now he was using them for a different purpose. He knew where every McCoy lived, worked, moved through their daily routines. In mountains this isolated, everyone knew everyone else's business, where they went to church, where they bought groceries, what time they left for work. Privacy didn't exist when you lived in hollows where sound carried for miles and neighbors watched each other out of habit and necessity. Dalton McCoy and his brothers, his cousins, his adult son, 12 men total, who worked the still and knew the recipe now, who could pass it on to others, who could dilute 63 years of Harlow legacy until it meant nothing. Raymond's plan was surgical: eliminate everyone who knew the stolen recipe before they could spread it further, before Harlow moonshine became just another product anyone could make. Thomas brought his military experience to the planning, the tactical thinking he'd learned in Vietnam about timing and coordination and how to move through terrain without being detected. He'd spent 2 years hunting men through jungle that was nearly as dense as these mountains, had learned to read landscapes, to identify choke points and ambush positions, to calculate sight lines and ranges. That knowledge transferred perfectly to hunting men through Appalachian hollows. David brought his mechanical knowledge, understanding of vehicles and tools and how to make accidents look convincing. He knew which roads had the sharpest curves, where guardrails were weak or missing, how to make a brake line fail in a way that wouldn't be detected in a cursory investigation. He understood timing belts and steering linkages, fuel lines and electrical systems, all the ways a vehicle could malfunction catastrophically if someone knew exactly which components to compromise. Michael brought youth and physical strength, the capability to do what age and injury had stolen from Raymond and Thomas. He was strong enough to carry a body if necessary, fast enough to cover ground quickly, young enough that adrenaline wouldn't exhaust him the way it would his father or older brothers. Raymond brought something none of his sons possessed: the absolute certainty that what they were about to do was necessary, was justified by codes older than federal law, was demanded by honor and legacy, and the simple fact that the system had failed completely. He'd tried restraint, had given the McCoys 3 chances to return what they'd stolen, had even gone to the sheriff seeking legal recourse. Every attempt at civilized resolution had failed. The code was unambiguous now. You protected what was yours because nobody else would. You answered theft with consequences severe enough to prevent future violations. You made examples that other men would remember and fear. Raymond wasn't rationalizing or justifying. He was simply following rules he'd been taught since childhood, about how mountain justice worked when formal law couldn't reach. They planned for 3 hours until nearly midnight, mapping out targets and timing and contingencies. Thomas would handle the long-range eliminations, the shots from distance where his sniper training gave him capabilities none of the others possessed. David would handle anything requiring mechanical knowledge or the appearance of accidents. Michael would provide support, move equipment, watch for witnesses, handle whatever physical tasks emerged. Raymond would coordinate, would make the final decisions about timing and targets, and would personally handle Dalton McCoy, because that confrontation required the head of the Harlow family facing the head of the McCoy family. By midnight, they had a plan that would unfold over 3 nights, November 8th through 10th, targeting 12 men in locations spread across Pike County. It was methodical, calculated, and utterly without mercy. They weren't psychopaths finding joy in violence. They were desperate men following a code that seemed logical within their framework, that made perfect sense in a world where 63 years of legacy had been stolen and law offered no protection. November 8th, 1979, Thursday night. Temperature dropped to 31 degrees after sunset. Fog rolled through the hollows, so thick visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet. The Harlows moved at 11 o'clock, after most people had gone to bed, when the mountains were dark except for occasional porch lights that looked like stars suspended in the blackness. Raymond drove. Thomas rode passenger, with his rifle wrapped in canvas. David and Michael followed in David's truck with tools and equipment they might need. They moved without headlights once they left the main roads, navigating by memory and moonlight, following paths they'd driven since childhood. The first target was Vernon McCoy, Dalton's younger brother, the aggressive one who'd told them they couldn't prove anything, who'd been most vocal about the McCoys' right to make whatever moonshine they wanted, regardless of whose recipe they'd stolen. Vernon lived alone in a trailer near Shelby Creek, 4 miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by woods on 3 sides. Thomas had scouted the location 2 days earlier, identified the best position for a shot, a ridgeline 200 yards northeast that overlooked Vernon's property, with clear sight lines to the windows. They parked half a mile away, walked in through the woods, carrying only what Thomas needed, his rifle and spotting scope and the knowledge he'd accumulated over 43 confirmed kills in Vietnam. Vernon's trailer had lights on in the living room, television flickering blue through thin curtains. Thomas set up on the ridgeline, used his scope to confirm it was Vernon sitting in a recliner watching television, probably drunk based on the beer cans visible on the table beside him. One shot, center mass, through the window, and Vernon's chest simultaneously. The sound echoed through the hollow, loud as thunder, but sound traveled strange in these mountains, and by the time anyone identified the direction, it would be too late. Second target was Marcus McCoy, a cousin, lived 4 miles east near Freeburn in a small house at the end of a long driveway. The plan was different here. Had to look like a hunting accident rather than murder because 2 obvious shootings in one night would alert law enforcement too quickly. Marcus kept chickens, went out every morning around 5:30 to feed them before work, walked the same path from his back door to the coop 50 yards away. David and Michael positioned themselves in the woods at 4:30 in the morning, November 9th now, waiting in darkness while frost formed on their jackets. when Marcus emerged at 5:35, coffee mug in hand, and completely unaware. Michael's shotgun blast from 30 feet looked exactly like a hunting accident, a tragic mistake by someone shooting deer too close to residential areas. The body wouldn't be found for hours, not until Marcus's wife came looking for him. Third target was Carl McCoy, Dalton's youngest brother. Worked third shift at a lumber mill in Jenkins, got off at midnight and drove home through mountain roads that were dangerous even in daylight. David had scouted the route, identified a curve on Route 197, where the road dropped away sharply on one side, where guardrails were old and rusted and wouldn't stop a vehicle traveling at speed. They waited near that curve, watched Carl's pickup truck approach at 12:45 in the morning, headlights cutting through fog. As he rounded the curve, David stepped into the road with a flashlight, made Carl swerve, overcorrect, and the truck went through the guardrail exactly as planned. It rolled twice before hitting trees 50 feet down the embankment. Carl died on impact. The steering wheel crushed his chest, and by the time emergency responders reached the scene hours later, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like: drunk driving on a dangerous road. By sunrise November 9th, 3 McCoy men were dead. Pike County Sheriff's Department responded to each incident separately, didn't immediately connect them because they occurred in different locations and appeared to have different causes. One shooting that looked like it could be personal, domestic, drug-related. One hunting accident that happened every year when people were careless with firearms near homes. One vehicle crash on a road known for accidents, where 3 people had died in the past 5 years. The pattern wasn't obvious yet to anyone except the surviving McCoys, who understood immediately that the Harlows were coming, that restraint had ended, that mountain justice was being served in the oldest and most brutal way possible. Dalton McCoy, when he heard about his brothers, knew he had maybe 24 hours to respond, to run, or to accept what was coming. The Harlows returned home at dawn, November 9th, exhausted and covered in frost. Clara had coffee ready, didn't ask questions, didn't want to know details. She just looked at her husband's face, saw something there that terrified her, and turned away. Raymond sat at the kitchen table smoking a cigarette, hands steady, no visible remorse or uncertainty. Thomas cleaned his rifle with the same methodical care he'd used in Vietnam, the ritual of maintenance that had kept him alive through 2 tours. David and Michael ate breakfast in silence, eggs and biscuits that tasted like nothing, their bodies demanding fuel even as their minds tried to process what they'd done. They'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had become something they'd never intended to be, and the night had only begun the work that would continue for 2 more days. By morning, Pike County Sheriff's Department was investigating 3 deaths. Sheriff Dennis Porter stood in his office looking at 3 separate incident reports, feeling something cold settle in his stomach as he started to see the pattern. All 3 victims were McCoys. All 3 died within 8 hours. The hunting accident he could believe happened every season. The car crash he could believe, Route 197, had killed people before. But the shooting through Vernon's window felt different, felt deliberate, and when you added them together, the coincidence seemed impossible. He called Kentucky State Police Barracks in Pikeville, requested assistance, said he might have a situation developing that exceeded his department's capabilities. State police said they'd send investigators, but it would take time to assemble a team. Probably wouldn't arrive until evening. The Harlow's new time was compressed now. By nightfall, law enforcement presence would increase, roadblocks might go up, and their freedom of movement would become restricted. They needed to move faster, eliminate more targets in a shorter time frame, accept higher risks because waiting was more dangerous than acting. November 9th, they moved at dawn, while fog still hung thick enough to provide cover. 4th through 7th targets were 4 McCoy cousins who worked at the still site, were there every morning by 6 o'clock, checking temperatures and starting the day's production. The Harlows knew exactly where the still was located, in a hollow off Coon Creek, accessible by one narrow trail that wound through dense woods. Everyone knew everyone else's business in these mountains. Thomas, David, Michael, and Raymond positioned themselves at 3 points around the still site, arriving at 5:30, while darkness still provided concealment. They waited in silence, rifles ready, as the 4 McCoys arrived separately between 6 o'clock and 6:15. The cousins were comfortable here, in their own space, never imagining they were walking into an ambush. When all 4 were present and gathered around the still discussing the day's work, Raymond gave the signal, a low whistle that sounded like a bird call. 3 rifles fired simultaneously from 3 positions. Over in 90 seconds, 4 men dead before they understood what was happening, before they could run or fight or even fully process that they were under attack. The Harlows left them where they fell, didn't move the bodies or try to conceal what had happened. This was a message, as much as an elimination. 8th target was James McCoy, Dalton's oldest son, 25 years old, married with a baby on the way, lived in a small rental house near Phyllis. Raymond insisted on handling this one personally because James was the next generation, represented the future of the McCoy operation, would inherit whatever knowledge his father had gained from the stolen journal. Raymond knocked on James's door at 11 o'clock in the morning, broad daylight, not hiding anymore, because speed mattered more than concealment now. When James answered, Raymond saw his father Dalton's features in the younger man's face, saw the recognition and fear in James's eyes as he understood who was standing on his porch. Raymond said, "Your father stole from my family. You helped him use what he stole." James tried to explain, said he didn't know it was stolen, thought his father had developed it himself. Raymond shot him in the doorway, left him there for his pregnant wife to find. 9th target was Robert McCoy, another cousin, worked as a mechanic at a gas station in Elkhorn City. David handled this one because it required timing and precision in a public location where witnesses might appear. He waited until Robert was alone under a car on a hydraulic lift, working on a transmission, radio playing loud enough to mask footsteps. David kicked the jack stand, the lift dropped, and Robert died instantly under 3,000 pounds of Ford pickup truck. David was gone before anyone else in the shop realized something had happened. Just another customer leaving after buying cigarettes and gas. By nightfall, November 9th, 9 men were dead. The pattern was now undeniable to everyone, law enforcement and the remaining McCoys. Kentucky State Police arrived at 6 o'clock Thursday evening, set up a command post in the sheriff's office, started coordinating a response that was already too late to prevent what came next. State police set up roadblocks on the main routes through Pike County, Route 23, Route 197, Route 46. But these mountains had hundreds of back roads, logging trails that didn't appear on any map, creek beds you could drive through if you knew where the rocks were, paths that families had been using for 200 years to move illegal goods away from government eyes. The Harlows knew every one of them, could navigate Pike County blindfolded if necessary. The roadblocks were theater, made police feel like they were doing something, but they wouldn't stop men who'd grown up learning to evade revenue agents and forestry police and anyone else who represented federal authority. By 9 o'clock Thursday night, while state police sat at roadblocks hoping someone would drive past them, the Harlows were moving again through fog and darkness toward their final targets. November 10th, 1979, Friday. The temperature dropped to 26 degrees, the coldest night yet. Frost forming so thick it looked like snow in the headlights of state police cruisers positioned at their useless roadblocks. 10th target was Wesley McCoy, Dalton's older brother. Lived near Stone, in a house that had been in the McCoy family for 3 generations. Wesley was 46 years old, had worked in the mines until they closed, now worked the still with his brothers and cousins and nephews, was one of the 12 who knew the stolen recipe. Thomas handled this elimination from distance again, positioned on a hillside 300 yards from Wesley's house with clear sight lines to the kitchen window where Wesley sat drinking coffee at 10 o'clock at night, unable to sleep, because he knew the Harlows were coming and didn't know when. One shot through glass and skull, and Wesley never heard the sound that killed him. 11th target was Jack McCoy, a distant cousin who'd been bragging at Louise's diner in Pikeville about their new recipe, about how McCoy moonshine was better than Harlow now, about how they'd figured out the secret that made the Harlow's product special. Raymond heard about this from 3 different sources, and Jack's bragging moved him up the priority list. Jack lived in a trailer near Phelps, worked 3rd shift at a warehouse, was home alone most nights until his wife got off her waitressing shift at midnight. David and Michael found him at 11:15, made it quick, made it look like a home invasion robbery that had gone wrong. The kind of crime that happened occasionally when drug addicts were desperate for money. They took his wallet and television to sell the story, left through the back door before anyone noticed. 12th target was Dalton McCoy himself. Raymond insisted on this one personally, wouldn't delegate it to his sons. Needed to face the man who'd stolen his family's legacy and make sure Dalton understood exactly why he was dying. Dalton's house at 2 o'clock in the morning, lights off, everyone asleep, except Dalton, who sat at his kitchen table with a shotgun across his lap, knowing someone would come eventually, hoping maybe he could take one of them with him when they did. Raymond knocked on the door, didn't try to hide or ambush. This confrontation required directness. When Dalton answered with the shotgun raised, Raymond stood in the doorway with his hands visible, no weapon drawn, and said 5 words. "You knew what that recipe meant to my family." Dalton tried to explain, voice shaking. Said his son needed surgery they couldn't afford. His daughter wanted to go to college. He was desperate. Didn't think the Harlows would miss one journal when they knew the recipe by heart anyway. He said he never intended disrespect, never meant to take anything sacred, just wanted to give his family a chance at something better than poverty and desperation. Raymond listened to all of it, standing there in the cold, while fog swirled around his boots, then said, "I know, I'm desperate too. That's why we're both here." He drew the revolver from his coat pocket, a .38 special he'd carried since Korea, fired once into Dalton's chest from 5 feet away. Dalton dropped the shotgun, fell backward into his hallway, died looking up at Raymond's face, which showed no satisfaction or rage or emotion of any kind, just the terrible blankness of a man who'd done what necessity demanded. Sarah McCoy found her husband at dawn, came downstairs at 6 o'clock to make coffee, and found him lying in a pool of blood that had spread across the hardwood floor her grandfather had installed in 1935. She didn't scream, didn't call for help immediately, just stood there looking at the body of the man she'd married 24 years ago, the father of her 4 children, the person she'd built a life with in these mountains where life was hard, but they'd managed together. Then she went to the phone, called the sheriff's office, said in a voice completely devoid of emotion, "Dalton's dead." The Harlows finally came. By sunrise November 10th, 12 men were dead across 12 square miles of Pike County. The Harlow purge was complete. Mountain justice had been served according to codes that had governed these hollows for 2 centuries. Codes that said theft demanded consequences, that legacy mattered more than law, that desperate men did unthinkable things when systems failed them completely. Kentucky State Police converged on Pike County throughout the morning of November 10th. FBI field office in Lexington sent agents, federal marshals arrived from Charleston, and suddenly these mountains that had been ignored by law enforcement for decades were crawling with authorities trying to make sense of 12 bodies and the systematic elimination of an entire moonshine operation. They interviewed witnesses, collected evidence, mapped out the killings in chronological order, and arrived at the same conclusion everyone who lived in Pike County had reached hours earlier. The Harlows had done this, all 4 of them working together, father and sons, eliminating their rivals in the most calculated family operation in Appalachian history. The only question was whether the Harlows would run or surrender. Raymond made that decision for all of them, Friday morning at breakfast. Kentucky State Police arrived at the Harlow property November 11th, 1979, Sunday morning at 6:30. They came with 8 vehicles, 16 officers, FBI Special Agent William Cross from Lexington, and enough firepower to handle armed resistance if the Harlows chose to fight. They found Raymond, Thomas, David, and Michael sitting at the kitchen table having breakfast, coffee, and eggs and biscuits Clara had made despite knowing this would be the last meal she'd cook for her family in this house. Raymond met the officers on the porch, hands visible, no weapons, and said calmly, "I assume you're here about the McCoys." Special Agent Cross read them their rights while other officers searched the property, finding the rifles, the revolver, clothing that smelled like gunpowder and blood. Thomas's rifle matched ballistics from 3 shooting scenes. Tire tracks connected David's truck to 2 locations. Raymond's fingerprints were on Dalton McCoy's doorframe. His boots matched prints in the dirt outside Vernon's trailer. But most damning was Raymond's confession. He didn't deny anything, didn't lawyer up, or demand to speak with an attorney. He just stated facts in the same flat voice he'd used planning the eliminations. Dalton McCoy stole my grandfather's journal containing our family's moonshine recipe. He and 11 others used what they stole. I took back what belonged to me, their ability to profit from our legacy. No remorse in his words, no plea for understanding, just mountain logic that made perfect sense to him and no sense at all to federal law. They were arrested without incident, handcuffed and loaded into separate vehicles for transport to Pike County Jail. Clara watched from the doorway, didn't cry, just stood there while her husband and 3 sons were taken away. Thomas's wife Jennifer was there with the 2 daughters, the girls crying and asking why the police were taking their daddy. David had no one. His ex-wife was in Ohio and didn't care. Michael's girlfriend Rebecca stood in the driveway watching them leave, 7 weeks pregnant with a child that would never know its father outside prison walls. The house felt empty after they left, haunted by what had been planned there, by the maps spread on the kitchen table and the quiet conversations about who would die and when. Pike County Circuit Court, March 1980. Commonwealth of Kentucky versus Raymond Harlow, Thomas Harlow, David Harlow, and Michael Harlow. 12 counts of first-degree murder each. 48 total charges that carried mandatory life sentences if convicted. The trial lasted 3 weeks, drew national media attention, reporters from New York and Los Angeles flying into Pikeville to cover what newspapers called the Appalachian moonshine murders. Defense attorney Marcus Webb argued systemic failures, economic collapse that left families with no legitimate survival options, stolen intellectual property with no legal remedy, law enforcement 60 miles away and unable to protect citizens, a culture where mountain codes replaced absent federal authority. He called expert witnesses on Appalachian history, sociologists who explained honor cultures, economists who detailed coal industry collapse. Prosecution was led by Commonwealth attorney Patricia Morrison, 42 years old, born in Pike County but educated at University of Kentucky Law School, someone who understood these mountains but refused to excuse what had happened in them. She methodically presented evidence, 12 bodies across 3 days, premeditation and planning, obvious in the coordination and timing, victims shot in their homes while watching television or sleeping, killed in ambushes or made to look like accidents. She put Sarah McCoy on the stand, made the jury look at Dalton's widow while she described finding her husband's body. She called James McCoy's pregnant wife, 8 months along, who testified about answering the door to find her husband dead on the porch. The jury deliberated 4 hours. Guilty on all counts, all 4 defendants, 48 convictions, total. Judge Henry Morrison, 63 years old, who'd grown up in these mountains and understood both the codes Raymond followed and the lines he'd crossed, delivered sentencing 2 weeks later. Raymond Harlow, life without possibility of parole. Thomas Harlow, life without possibility of parole. Due to his military training, making him particularly dangerous. David Harlow, life with possibility of parole after 25 years. Michael Harlow, life with possibility of parole after 25 years, the youngest and possibly redeemable, according to the judge's reasoning. Judge Morrison's statement from the bench became famous in legal circles studying Appalachian justice. I understand the code you followed, Mr. Harlow. My grandfather followed the same code. But you crossed a line no human being should cross, regardless of provocation or economic desperation or cultural tradition. Clara Harlow had a complete psychological breakdown, 3 weeks after sentencing, was hospitalized at Pike County Medical Center for psychiatric care after neighbors found her wandering barefoot through the woods behind her house talking to people who weren't there. She spent 6 weeks in treatment, was diagnosed with severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, was released to her sister's care because doctors didn't trust her alone. She never fully recovered, spent the next 14 years as a ghost of herself, taking medication that dulled everything, including the pain. She visited Raymond in prison only twice, couldn't bear seeing him in the orange jumpsuit behind plexiglass, couldn't reconcile the man she'd married with the man who'd eliminated 12 people methodically. She died in 1994 at 69. Her death certificate listed heart failure, but everyone knew it was really broken heart syndrome, the medical term for dying of grief. Thomas's daughters, Jennifer and Rebecca, were 8 and 6 in 1979 when their father was arrested. They were raised by Clara's sister in Prestonsburg, grew up with the Harlow name like a curse, following them through school where other children knew what their father had done. Jennifer changed her last name at 18, became Jennifer Hendricks, using her grandmother's maiden name, moved to Columbus, Ohio, where nobody knew her history. She became a nurse, never married, developed severe trust issues that prevented intimate relationships, and sends letters to her father in prison, maybe once a year out of obligation rather than affection. Rebecca had worse outcomes, developed severe anxiety disorder in her teens, attempted suicide twice before age 25, lives on disability in a group home in Lexington, medicated and supervised and incapable of independent life. David's ex-wife was in Ohio when the arrests happened, remarried within a year to someone who'd never heard of the Harlows or Pike County. David has no contact with her, no children to maintain connection with his life before prison. Michael's girlfriend Rebecca was pregnant when the arrests occurred. 7 weeks, along with a child that could have been Michael's first connection to a future beyond moonshine and mountain codes. She had an abortion 3 weeks after his conviction, couldn't imagine raising a child alone with the Harlow name, and moved to Virginia to live with her sister. She married someone else in 1983, had 3 children who know nothing about the boy she almost had with Michael Harlow. Sarah McCoy, Dalton's widow, was left at 40 years old with 4 children under 25. No income beyond Dalton's small life insurance policy and a husband's body she had to bury while reporters photographed her grief. She tried to stay in Pike County initially, thought maybe the community would support her, but the stares and whispers became unbearable. Some people blamed Dalton for stealing the recipe, said he'd brought this on himself and his family. Mountain logic that made victims responsible for provoking their own murders. Others were sympathetic but couldn't help financially, were struggling themselves. 6 months after the trial, Sarah sold everything, moved to Virginia Beach to live with her sister, worked as a grocery store cashier for 30 years, until arthritis forced retirement. She never remarried, told her sister once that she couldn't imagine trusting another man, after watching what desperation had turned Dalton into. She died in 2019 at 80. Her obituary made no mention of how her husband had died or what had destroyed her family. Dalton's children scattered like leaves in wind. James was dead, killed on his own porch with his pregnant wife inside. The daughter Rebecca, 22, when her father died, finished her associate's degree at community college, became a teacher in Lexington, married a man who knew about her father but loved her anyway. She doesn't discuss it, change the subject when students or colleagues ask about her family, carries the weight silently. The youngest son, Matthew, was 16 when the Harlows came, finished high school in Virginia Beach while living with his mother and aunt, joined the Marines at 18, trying to escape into structure and purpose. He served 8 years, came home with his own demons, struggled with alcohol and prescription painkillers, died of an overdose in 2001 at 34. The baby James's wife was carrying when he died was born in April 1980, a girl named Emily who grew up knowing her father only through photographs and stories that always ended with violence. Of the 12 men eliminated, they left behind 8 widows and 23 children total. Vernon McCoy had no children, lived alone. Carl McCoy's 3 kids were raised by his widow in Virginia. All changed their last names as adults. The 4 cousins killed at the Still site left behind 9 children combined who grew up without fathers, raised by mothers working multiple jobs, collecting Social Security survivor benefits that barely covered food. All carry trauma that passed to the next generation through genetics and environment, PTSD and addiction, and relationship problems that psychologists recognize as inherited suffering. Some stayed in Pike County, most fled, but none escaped what happened that November. The weight follows them in nightmares and anniversary reactions, in the way they startle at loud noises, in the difficulty trusting that safety can last.